Hello, everyone, and welcome. First of all, I want to thank you for your time today and for allowing us to speak with you. My name is Laura Coto Ortega. I am a senior advocate with the Advocacy and Community Engagement team, or ACE. I just want to take a few minutes to talk about Disability Rights California, and then we'll start with the webinar. So, Disability Rights California, or DRC, was formerly known as Protection and Advocacy, is a nonprofit agency funded in 1978. Federally mandated to provide legal services for people with disabilities. Some of the issues we work on are special education, public benefits, regional center services, mental health, and so forth. We have more than 260 employees throughout California. Our regional offices are located in Sacramento, San Diego, Bay Area, and Los Angeles, and our smaller offices are located in Modesto, Ontario, and Fresno. Okay, so now we'll start on today's topic, which is social recreation, camping, art, dance, and music. Sorry, I'm trying to see if I can. Okay, here we go. And our goals for today's presentation are to develop a shared understanding of social recreation, camping, and non-medical therapy services, understanding how the law applies, and also learning how, like the steps to request services effectively and hopefully getting the service approved. Um, so with that, social recreation activities are community-based activities. Some of the examples are sports, swimming, karate, MMA, jiu-jitsu, dancing, music, arts, computers, summer camp, day camps, and clubs. Those are just some of the examples. And the social recreation activities, what they're trying to do is to promote community connection and participation, which would be also relationship building. So meeting new people, making friends, and then having that shared activities and interests with people with and without disabilities, skill building, personal growth and independence, well-being, and of course, very important, inclusion. I just want to give a little background of the social recreation funding. So, social recreation funding was suspended in 2009 due to budget cuts. That suspension had a negative impact on underserved communities. Community advocacy led to restore the funding. And finally, in the summer of 2021, funding was restored by lifting the suspension, but implementing guidance was unclear, creating challenges. So basically, regional centers didn't have vendors or any real type of relationship with agencies that provided these types of services. So that made it really challenging. And we'll go over more of this in our next slides. Um, and then on July 1st of 2023, a new law took effect to increase the access to social recreation, camping, art, dance, and music for individuals served by the regional centers. So on your screen, let me see. This is the Welfares and Institution Code, WIC code section 4688.22. This is the law that made the changes and that we'll go over them a little bit more. So with that, I believe I'll turn it over to the attorney, Rochelle, who will go over more and of understanding how the law applies and important legal points. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
So just brief introduction. My name is Rochelle Escobar. I am a staff attorney within DRC. So I work under the umbrella of the Legal Advocacy Unit within the Fair Hearing Project. I have been working with the agency for about 4 years now. and I primarily work with regional center consumers and their families, and specifically with the Spanish-speaking community. And so in the next 4 slides, I will be covering some of the important legal takeaways that we feel that really sort of highlight what the intent of the law is, right? And in eliminating some of the barriers that once existed as well. So really the intent of Welfare and Institutions Code Section 4688.22 is to make social recreation and camping services and the supports needed to access these services widely available. And I also, I not on the slide, but I wanted to cover some of the key sort of terms that we see under this WIC code. And that is really the intent is to promote full inclusion, independence, make different type of social recreation activities widely available, and not only to socialize, but also to lead the lives that every individual wants in their community. The idea is also that individuals have opportunities to build relationships, to engage in a space where with shared interests, right? So to really be able to participate with others who enjoy doing some of the same activities that you do, to reduce isolation, and to really assist consumers in advancing their own personal interest. Um, Also, that the intent of the law is to reduce a lot of the administrative barriers that once existed to be able to access social recreation or camping activities. And specifically, what the law says as well is that we want to reduce these barriers, especially for children, for people who have experienced disparities in accessing regional center services in the past, and also to those who can't afford to pay for services up front and wait for reimbursement, which was a common practice that we used to see before the implementation of the law. There were a lot of obstacles in terms of accessing this type of service, and families not being able to find vendors or providers, to that would work with them to be able to access this service, or families who were also struggling to make payments for some of these services. And, when engaging in conversations with the regional center about payment, sometimes it was an ongoing long process, right, to get approval and to get reimbursement back for some of the services that were already paid up front. Another important legal point to know is that the law really prohibit certain tactics to be used by regional centers, right, to limit access. And again, so eliminating the intent is to eliminate access barriers to the service. So one important thing to remember is that regional centers cannot require that IHSS be exhausted as a generic resource before being authorized to receive a social recreation or camping service. The point again of generic resources, and we're going to cover this in future slides as well, is that if another agency has the responsibility to provide the same type of service you're asking for from the regional center, then you need to seek their services first, or you need to ask them first to cover the service before the regional center can then pay for that service. In the case of IHSS, this is really meant for personal support, right, in the home. So it's a very distinct type of program and type of service that is being offered. While social recreation and camping activities take place outside of the home. And so it's quite different, right, from the purpose of IHSS. These are two very different services, not the same type of service, not the same type of purpose for the service either. So really, regional centers cannot require people to exchange this type of service to receive social rec or camping services, or even another one that we used to see quite frequently is the exchange of respite hours for this type of service or any other type of service. And so that is not allowed under the law. Another important legal point is that regional centers cannot require families to make a co-payment or otherwise share costs for a social recreation or camping services. And an example I can provide of this is, for example, if a service costs $500 per month, regional center then cannot say, we're only allowed to pay $200 for that activity, but you family or you consumer will be responsible for paying the remaining $300. And so that is also not allowed. However, there are exceptions to this, to the co-payment or to a shared cost, and that is for daycare services or respite services. And this is usually what we know as family cost participation. This is usually applied, so there is a criteria under family cost participation program. And usually the criteria is that the family has a child who is between the ages of 0 to 17, and the child lives at home. The child is not eligible for Medi-Cal, and the child is seeking, for example, two of the services that I mentioned, respite or daycare, and the family has an income that is at least 400% of the federal poverty level guidelines based on the number of individuals that live within the home or that form part of that family. And so that is the only exception in terms of cost participation. In the current slide that we're seeing is we want to remind everyone that social recreation and camping services are also available through participant-directed services. So consumers can choose to go through a regional center vendor, or they can choose someone who is not a vendor of the regional center. So if a provider is not a vendor of the regional center, then that vendor can be paid through a financial management service. And this is one of those other elimination of barriers to access the social recreation and camping service. Now on screen, we have the Department of Developmental Services, or DDS's, role in implementation. One thing that we want to highlight and remind everyone that aside from, the text of the law that we must follow, oftentimes DDS also will either distribute guidance or instructions on policies to the regional centers. And so these communications to the regional centers can look very differently. So for example, DDS might issue a directive, and a directive is instructions for regional centers to follow. They might issue program guidelines, and guidelines are rules that regional centers must follow for specific programs. Sometimes DDS might issue guidance, And guidances are details on items regional centers are encouraged to do or approaches to consider, but not required. And lastly, sometimes DDS will issue correspondence to the regional centers. And this is how DDS shares helpful information with the regional centers. And in this slide, we have included the direct link to all of these different types of guidance and instructions to the regional centers for your reference, in case you are interested in also keeping track of the communications that DDS issues to the regional centers. Now, I've mentioned that the law really, the intention was to reduce some of the barriers that existed to access this type of service. I have mentioned that, before there was a lack of vendored providers, which, depending in the community where you live in the state of California, it can be quite the challenge, right? Um, for a lot of reasons, providers might either not meet the criteria to become vendors of the regional centers, or it just requires additional things for them to consider to become a vendored provider. And so the idea with the law is that the consumer and the family have the option to seek whoever really they want to be to provide that service, right, to the consumer. So it does allow for more options for someone to be able to work with a specific provider in this area and to be able to contract with them as well. In the past, as mentioned, there were also issues with payment, right? So, again, it may be the regional centers were requiring the families or the consumers to share in the cost, or if the service was being authorized, maybe there was an agreement that the consumer or the family would pay upfront for the service and would have to go through a reimbursement process with the regional center. To recover the cost associated with that service. And sometimes what we would see were delays in getting reimbursement, also quite a lengthy process to follow in requesting the reimbursement. So sometimes that meant completing a lot of paperwork, submitting receipts, compiling different information, submitting that to the service coordinator, and it was a whole process. Sometimes that we've heard it could have taken 6 months or longer to get a reimbursement for the service. So the idea with the law is that we don't want to create those barriers or those financial obstacles in regards to this service anymore. The same goes with purchase of service policies. We see differences in the way that the regional centers handled the request for social recreation or camping services, or in the way that perhaps they authorized the service. And so the law really gives us that what the intent is with this service. It really tells us that regional centers should be eliminating the barriers to access this service. And it really gives more um, really key information of what the purpose is for these types of services, right? And that we should be prioritizing this service for consumers, for regional center consumers. Next slide. So on screen right now, it we have a recent guidance that was issued by DDS. When it comes to social recreation service and camping, since I want to say since 2022, at least we have seen a lot of different types of either a guidance, directive, or communication related to social recreation, camping, and non-medical therapies. The most recent one that we know of was issued in March 25th, 2026. So not that long ago. And this guidance basically says that it provides regional centers, basically the letter or the guidance provides regional centers with a standardized purchase of service policy for social recreation, camping, and non-medical therapy services. DDS basically recommends that the regional centers adopt this standardized policy without any modifications. Um, and if the only two modifications that are allowed, basically, without having to go through a more extensive approval process, as it's one that regional centers can insert the regional center exception policy language pursuing to Welfare's and Institutions Code Section 4620.3. And also consider incorporating some of the considerations that the regional center should also make when deciding to authorize a specific service. And then also the regional centers should put the standardized policy that DDS is suggesting on the regional center letterhead before returning that to the department for approval. So these are the only two changes that are basically allowed without any pre-approved or without any other extensive review process. If for any reason the regional center decides not to use this standardized purchase of service policy, and they decide to make modifications on their own beyond the two things that I just mentioned, then DDS will go ahead and complete its standard review process pursuant to Welfare's and Institutions Code Section 4434D, which will require a more extensive review of that regional center's purchase of service policy. So this is very important to know. A recent recommendation given by or guidance given by the Department of Developmental Services. In the materials that you do receive, you will also find the direct link to this specific guidance. We are monitoring how regional centers are reacting to this. And so we wanted to make you aware that this is something that is taking place. Next slide. Okay. So now we're going to transition over, we've covered what social recreation is. We've provided some examples. We've gone into some of the key points of the law. And now we're going to transition into some steps that you can take to make an effective request for a social recreation or camping activity, or even for other service requests with the regional center. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Laura.
Thank you, Rochelle. So the first one is to identify the need, right? Why are you asking for the service? When regional centers make decisions on what services to approve, they consider some of these questions. Do you need the service because of your developmental disability? Will the service lessen the effect of the developmental disability? And will the service help you have a normal, independent, productive life or help you learn a new skill in an appropriate way? So, what we need to do, or what would the service address? Would it alleviate the developmental disability, social, personal, physical, or economic habilitation, rehabilitation, achievement and maintenance of an independent, productive life, and what benefits are you hoping to get out of this service? Rochelle.
Okay. And the second thing to really consider, when thinking about before having the conversation with the regional center, right, or with your service coordinator, um, as Laura mentioned, it's really important to really have that moment to think through, right? How do I want to make this? How am I going to make this request to my service coordinator, or to the regional center? And so another important thing to think through about is how does this service connect to a need, or how does it connect to my IPP goal or my life area, right? We've seen changes to recently, right? There's been changes to the IPP template. Now where we have different sections or areas that are called life areas that either address things like communication, education, well-being, um, where do I want to live, for example? So different things. And so we really want to make sure that we're making that connection. Um, and some questions to ask, or a question to ask yourself is, how will this service help me accomplish one of these things in my IPP, whether that be a goal or whether that be a life area? And I want to also make sure that I can make that connection, right, to my IPP because everything does start with the IPP. So if I can make that connection, where am I making that connection? Am I making that connection to communication, for example, or educational development, or an interest I have in the community? Um, where am I making that connection and how? If I feel like there is nothing in my IPP that I can make, that I can connect this service to, right? Then I really need to think through of, wow, okay, so now we need to amend my IPP, right? We need to amend my IPP to make sure that it reflects what my interests are, to make sure that it reflects what my future goals are, that it reflects that I am interested in this activity and that this activity, this is how it's going to help me, and this is how it's going to help support either my goals or that life area. So it's very important to really sit with the IPP and ask yourself and go through that series of questions, right? And really making those connections. Next slide.
Okay, and another also that we have to consider for effective request is the show that there is no generic resource available. So as we know, the regional center always says that we have to exhaust our generic resources and that they're pair of last resort. So some of the generic resources are like Medi-Cal, Medicare, school districts, Department of Rehabilitation, the parks, social recreation areas that have those. So one thing to also know is that the law does allow regional centers to fund a service while you're trying to get that generic resource. Sometimes I think it's called gap funding, so that you could ask the regional center while, as an example, if that generic resource is available, but there's a long waiting list and you really need to get that service now, then you can ask the regional center to fund it while the generic resource would take over. And another thing, regional centers must help you access those generic resources. So a lot of times, even though you could get it from a recreation program or city park, the regional center is also able or should be able to help you at least um, go through that process and help you access that service through that generic resource.
And lastly, another thing to consider is less costly alternatives. And this basically, I'm gonna provide an example to better explain it. Basically, if you're looking into a service, let's say an art class, and you start looking into the community, right? You start looking at, like as Laura mentioned, different generic resources available in the community to see if they offer the type of art program that you are interested in. Maybe it's very specific, what your focus is, or the skills that you want to develop under the umbrella of art. And so you see that no, there's no park recreational activity that provides what I'm looking for. The YMCA doesn't provide that either. Other different programs in my community also are not going to meet my needs or what I'm looking for. And so you start looking at maybe private providers, right? That are going to charge a certain fee to participate in the classes. And so in that, you start looking at different options, at different providers, and you notice that one provider might charge for maybe like $100 for the session. Another one is charging $300 for the session. And then you have another one that's charging $600 for the session. Um, and you kind of want to compile that information to show the regional center, look, these are the different options that are available to me, and all of these meet what I am looking for, and all of these can, work with me, and it would be a great fit for me for X, Y, and Z reasons, right? And there is quite a different range between prices, and I found this one that, they're charging $100 for the type of service that I am looking for, the art class that I would like to participate in. And so that's, really good information to provide the regional center. It's like these are the options that are available, and I'm actually choosing to go with the least costly option because it meets everything that I'm looking for, even though these other ones also offer what I'm looking for, but they're just more costly. And so you kind of do that pre-homework, right? Of doing that research of what vendors are available and also what the costs are. Um, because let's say if you don't do that, then the regional center could also come back to you and say, well, we also know of this other vendor that also provides what you are looking for, but maybe they're charging less than what the rates of the providers you are proposing are charging. And that could happen, right? And then, the regional center could say, well, I think it's just best if we go with this provider that is charging a little bit less for the type of service that you are seeking. And so, really, in that conversation, what is important to keep in mind is that if, for example, the regional center does come back to you and say, well, we have, a provider that charges like $50 for that art session, you want to make sure that that provider does meet what you are looking for. And so, how is your service going to look? Does it match, what the other providers have to offer? Is it going to accomplish all or part of your IPP goals? Is it going to be consistent with, what you are looking for with your needs? Um, if the answer is yes, then you can consider going with what the regional center is proposing, or the other vendor that the regional center is proposing. But if the answer is no, then, that's not a service really that's going to meet, that provider is not going to meet that need, right? And so, um, all of this to say that you don't have to, settle for what the regional center is proposing, because in reality it is, who is going to be meeting all of the different needs and what you are looking for in that service, and who is going to be able to provide it in the least costly manner as well. And so these are all different conversations that could happen with the regional center. And that's why we're highlighting these different points in terms of things to think through when preparing to have that conversation with the regional center or with your service provider, because these are the most frequent, like, sort of topics that come up in conversation in thinking through the authorization of a service, not only social rec and camping, but other services as well. And so we just would like to share that so you keep this in mind moving forward when you do prepare to have these conversations with your service coordinator. Next slide. And back to Laura.
Okay, thank you. Well, so I think this concludes the webinar.